Following last year's North Dakota State Fair, we reported on concerns raised by the Ward County Sheriff's Office following several alcohol violations at the fair. As the calendar now turns to 2026, the county is continuing to work with the fair's vendor to prevent minors from being served. Lindsay Miller has more on their discussions.
At last week's special Ward County Commission meeting, several liquor licenses were reviewed before expiring at year's end. Commissioner John Feldall says they took a longer look at the request from M&S Concessions, who handles alcohol service on the North Dakota State Fairgrounds. Following reported underage drinking violations at last year's state fair, the commission suspended the license for M&S for 10 days in August. Owner Jeff Sanger said they took the situation very seriously and wanted to work with the county and local public health provider to improve their system. Feldall says the commission temporarily approved the company's license for the month of January with a few stipulations.
Better define the use and the location within the full fairgrounds facilities.
He explains the concessions company typically is granted a blanket license with no designation of where it will be used on the fairgrounds. This is unlike other applications for special events that list an exact time and place.
As far as how it's policed and who's in charge of that and those things is done properly.
There are roughly 10 buildings on the grounds that are used to serve alcohol at some point in the year. Feldall says having more details from the vendor would provide insight on if they have all that they need to properly identify whether customers are old enough to legally purchase alcohol.
You know who the responsible parties are, and if the responsible parties need to bring in their own carding entities or whatever to make sure it's managed properly.
Feldall explains licenses are approved by the state's attorney and sheriff's office before they come to the commission. He adds the state fair is not responsible for the license as they just provide the facilities. In Minot, I'm Lindsay Miller, reporting for your News Leader.
Commissioners unanimously voted to grant the temporary license. They will revisit it no later than their January 13th meeting. Now, we did reach out to M&S Concessions for comment we will update you when we hear back.